For 43 years, I work as a registered nurse in a nursing home. The words I came to dread most were not, "she fell," or "he had a stroke." They were, "we thought it was just old age." Families usually said that after something frightening had happened. Yet the decline had often begun months earlier. A resident arriving late to breakfast, or a woman pressing both hands into her chair before she could stand. The changes looked ordinary. That was why they were so easy to explain away. I believed 43 years of watching them would make me different. Then, at 91, I turned from my kitchen sink and caught the counter. Days later, I noticed how much effort it took to rise from my chair. And I gave myself the same answer I had heard for decades. "Helen, you are old. What did you expect?" That is the part I regret. I had recognized quiet decline in hundreds of older people, yet I was beginning to hide it from myself. Today, I want to share 7 changes I learned not to dismiss. They cannot predict how long you will live, and they are not a test. But when they are new or worsening, they may reveal that the strength protecting your independence is narrowing. Before the first sign, you need to understand what that strength really is. During my years in the nursing home, I learned that the body is not simply healthy or sick. Between the two is what I came to think of as reserve. I once watched 2 residents of the same age face the same infection. Both survived. One returned to the dining room within days. The other never regained enough strength to return to her old routine. The difference was not courage. One body simply had more capacity left to recover. Reserve is the extra strength that helps you catch yourself, rise after sitting, recover after illness, and still manage ordinary life. When reserve begins to shrink, the first clue is often not what you cannot do. It is what you quietly start avoiding. The signs are not a verdict. What matters is a change from what was normal for you. And one of the earliest changes I learned to notice was the pace of a person's walk. The first sign often appeared in the long hallway leading to the dining room. A resident who once arrived early began arriving late. Then she chose the nearest chair. Weeks later, she stopped joining the afternoon walk and blamed the weather. Sometimes the weather was only an excuse. The distance had quietly become harder. I learned not to ask only, "Can this person still walk?" I asked, "Has the way this person walks changed?" Not long ago, that question met me at a crossing near my home. I began waiting for a fresh signal because I no longer trusted myself to cross comfortably once the countdown had begun. I called it caution. Part of it was, but part of it was my reluctance to admit that my usual pace had changed. Walking asks many systems of the body to work together. A new slowdown can have many causes, especially with pain, weakness, dizziness, or unusual shortness of breath. Do not compare your pace with a neighbor's, or use a stopwatch to frighten yourself. Research describes group patterns. It cannot tell one person how many years remain. The useful question is simpler. Am I moving differently? And have I begun arranging my life around it? Sometimes the next answer appears before you take even one step. Before I watched a resident walk, I often watched how the person stood. Someone would slide toward the edge, lean forward, and turn one supporting hand into 2. Sometimes the first attempt failed, and the person sat back as though they had changed their mind. Standing did not look dramatic enough to mention. But when it becomes harder, so can using the toilet, climbing steps, getting out of a car, or recovering from the floor. At 91, I had developed a ritual of my own. I placed my cup down, moved to the edge of my chair, pressed both palms into the armrests, and waited a moment after standing before I walked. Using support is not shameful. Chairs differ, and pain, stiffness, injury, and balance matter. What caught my attention was change. 6 months earlier, I had not needed the same preparation. Please do not turn this into a home challenge. A movement used in a supervised assessment may be unsafe for someone already weak or unsteady. If the difficulty is new or progressing, ask a professional why and what movement is safe for you. I once assumed weakness would announce itself through my legs. Then I noticed the objects my hands had begun avoiding. Hands often reveal change through the objects they quietly stop choosing. In the nursing home, a buttoned shirt became a pullover. A heavy mug became a plastic cup. Someone stopped cutting meat and said she no longer liked it. Another waited for an aide to open containers. No single choice proved anything. The pattern was what mattered. I eventually found that pattern in my own kitchen. I began lifting my old skillet with both hands. I divided groceries into smaller bags. When a jar would not open, I returned it to the refrigerator and pretended I had changed my mind. Measured properly, grip strength can provide information about overall strength and physical condition. But a weak handshake is not a diagnosis, and a rubber ball cannot correct every cause. Arthritis, pain, nerve problems, medication effects, illness, and loss of muscle can all affect the hands. I was not concerned because my hands were weaker than a younger woman's. I was concerned because they were weaker than my own hands had been. Once I admitted that, I watched whether the change was progressing and asked what evaluation and strength work were appropriate for me. The most frightening sign, however, was not something I dropped. It was the kitchen counter I suddenly needed to catch myself. One morning, I turned from the sink toward the kitchen table and felt the room shift beneath me. My hand reached for the counter before I had time to think. It passed within seconds. I finished making my tea and told no one. That silence frightened me more than the stumble. I had watched residents do the same. They began walking near walls, touching chairs as they passed, avoiding quick turns, and staying out of places where there was nothing solid to hold. Their world became smaller before anyone understood why. Those small adjustments could keep someone safe for a while. They could also conceal how much confidence and function had already been lost. One loss of balance cannot explain its cause. The eyes, inner ear, nerves, muscles, joints, blood pressure, hydration, illness, and medications may all play a role. What troubled me was how quickly I began adapting without investigating. I was not simply being careful. I was quietly designing my movements around the fear that it might happen again. Do not test this by standing on one leg alone. Repeated dizziness, unsteadiness, reaching for furniture to steady yourself, near falls, or a fall deserve a proper evaluation. Sudden dizziness or trouble walking can require urgent care, especially with weakness, numbness, severe headache, chest pain, fainting, or difficulty speaking. A fall may be the event everyone remembers. The warning can begin much earlier. The fifth sign was quieter still. It had been appearing on my dinner plate for months. During my nursing years, an unfinished meal could worry me more than a complaint chart. I watched trays return nearly untouched. Rings loosened, clothes began to hang differently. Families said, "She has always been a light eater," even when the change was new. Then my husband died, and I began doing the same thing. A bowl of soup lasted 2 meals. Some evenings I ate crackers with tea and called it dinner. Cooking for one felt like too much work, and hunger no longer arrived with authority. When my clothes became loose, I treated it as one of the few conveniences of growing old. Then my doctor asked me one simple question. "Were you trying to lose weight?" I said no. For years, I had asked families versions of that question. Now 5 ordinary words exposed what I had refused to see. Hearing my answer ended the argument I had been having with myself. Medication, dental problems, difficulty swallowing, illness, pain, depression, grief, and isolation can all contribute to unintentional weight loss. Some of that loss may be muscle, leaving less strength when illness arrives. A nutritional drink may help in some situations, but it should not replace looking for the reason the weight is being lost. My doctor reviewed my medications, swallowing, mood, and meals. I kept simple foods I would actually prepare. More importantly, I stopped pretending grief had nothing to do with my appetite. I had spent decades watching older people disappear a few pounds at a time. I never imagined I would begin doing the same. The next sign taught me that spending a long night in bed did not necessarily mean my body had recovered. For a long time, I said I slept well because I spent 8 hours in bed, but I woke tired. By early afternoon, I was asleep in my chair. Preparing dinner felt like work, and invitations I once enjoyed began to sound exhausting. Again, I called it age. Nursing had taught me that time in bed and restorative sleep are not the same. Pain, frequent urination, breathing problems, medications, anxiety, depression, and sleep disorders can all interrupt rest. Loud snoring, gasping, or breathing pauses also deserve attention, especially with daytime sleepiness. A new pattern should not be dismissed or treated only with a bedtime trick. I did make modest changes. I opened the curtains after waking. I kept a more regular schedule. I stopped letting an afternoon nap take over the day. I also stopped assuming coffee was an answer. Persistent fatigue and changed daytime function deserved a conversation with a professional. No single number of hours guarantees health. What mattered was whether sleep restored me and whether my daytime energy had changed. The 7th sign was the only one I had never found in a chart. After my husband died, I began asking myself, if I did not leave this house for an entire week, who would notice? The question hurt because I could name people who loved me, but few places that expected me. My children and grandchildren called. But after retirement and my husband's death, my days were no longer connected to anyone else's routine. If I stayed home on Monday, nothing changed. If I stayed home again on Tuesday, nothing changed then either. In the nursing home, some residents still had small reasons to appear. One watered plants. Another waited for a weekly card game. A third attended morning exercise from her chair. Their lives were not crowded. But someone noticed their absence. I had lost that. So I began caring for 3 plants at a local community center each Sunday. It was modest, but it required me to get up, eat, dress, leave home, and speak to someone. No grand rescue occurred. The plants were not medicine. They were simply a standing appointment with the world, and at that point, I needed one. I simply became expected somewhere again. Eventually, I placed a camera before my chair and shared what elder care had taught me, and what I understood only after growing old myself. This camera is part of my answer. I am not here because reaching 91 made me wise about everything. I am here because being useful still gives me a reason to show up. Isolation and loneliness are not the same, and neither is measured by counting friends. I needed to feel known and connected beyond my front door. That responsibility helped the other changes I was making. It gave me a reason to walk, eat, keep a schedule, and remain part of the world. The 7th sign did not appear in my body. It appeared in the question of whether my life still required my presence. I cannot tell you that I pass all 7 signs. I still walk slowly. I sometimes use my hands to rise. My grip is weaker. and some mornings follow a poor night's sleep. I did not become young again. That was never the goal. The goal was to notice change early enough to protect the ability that remained. After 43 years in a nursing home, I know how tempting it is to wait for the fall, the hospitalization, or the morning an ordinary task becomes impossible. But the body often speaks before it shouts. It speaks through things that become slower, harder, less frequent, or quietly avoided. Do not compare yourself with someone younger or use these signs to diagnose yourself. Compare yourself with your recent past. Ask what changed, how quickly, and what you have begun avoiding. New, sudden, or worsening changes deserve attention. Accepting help early is not surrender. Sometimes it protects independence. I used to ask, how many years do I have left? Now I ask, what is my body asking me to protect today? I spent 43 years caring for older people from one side of the bed rail. At 91, I finally understand the other side. Your body cannot promise more years, but it can tell you what needs protecting in the days that remain yours. If you have recognized one of these changes in yourself, you may share it below. Sometimes admitting what has changed is the first step toward protecting what has not.